Hello everyone, I'm going to read the next chapter of Boy, Tales of Childhood by Roald Dahl. We're on the third section now, which is about Llandaff Cathedral School, set from 1923 until 1925. This is when Roald Dahl was aged 7 to age 9. The Bicycle and the Sweet Shop. When I was 7, my mother decided I should leave kindergarten and go to a proper boys' school. By good fortune, there existed a well-known preparatory school for boys about a mile from our house. It was called Llandaff Cathedral School, and it stood right under the shadow of Llandaff Cathedral. Like the cathedral, the school is still there and is still flourishing. But here again, I can remember very little about the 2 years I attended Llandaff Cathedral School. Between the age of 7 and 9, only 2 moments remain clearly in my mind. The first lasted not more than 5 seconds, but I will never forget it. It was my first term, and I was walking home alone across the village green after school, and when suddenly one of our senior Year 12 boys came riding full speed down the road on his bicycle, about 20 yards away from me. The road was on a hill, and the boy was going down the slope. As he flashed by, he started backpedaling very quickly, so that the freewheeling mechanism of his bike made a loud whirring sound. At the same time, he took his hands off the handlebars and folded them casually across his chest. I stopped dead and stared at him. How wonderful he was! How swift and brave and graceful, in his long trousers with bicycle clips around them, and his scarlet school cap at a jaunty angle on his head. One day I told myself, one glorious day I will have a bike like that, and I will wear long trousers with bicycle clips, and my school cap will sit at a jaunty angle on my head, and I will go whizzing downhill, pedalling backwards with no hands on the handlebars. I promise you that if somebody had caught me by the shoulder at that moment and said to me, "What is your greatest wish in life, little boy? What is your absolute ambition? To be a doctor? To be a fine musician? A painter? A writer? Or the Lord Chancellor?" I would have answered without hesitation that my only ambition, my hope, my longing was to have a bike like that and to go whizzing down the hill with no hands on the handlebars. It would be fabulous. It made me tremble just to think about it. My second and only other memory of Llandaff Cathedral School is extremely bizarre. It happened a little over a year later, when I was just 9. By then I made some friends, and when I walked to school in the mornings, I would start out alone, but would pick up 4 other boys of my own age along the way. After school was over, the same 4 boys and I would set out together across the village green and through the village itself, heading for home. On the way to school and on the way back, we always passed the sweet shop. No, we didn't. We never passed it. We always stopped. We lingered outside its rather small window, gazing in at the big glass jars full of bull's eyes and old-fashioned humbugs and strawberry bonbons and glacier mints and acid drops and pear drops and lemon drops and all the rest of them. Each of us received 6 pence a week for pocket money, and whenever there was any money in our pockets, we would all troop in together to buy a pennyworth of this or that. My own favourites were sherbet suckers and licorice bootlaces. One of the other boys, whose name was Thwaites, told me that I should never eat licorice bootlaces. Thwaites' father was a doctor, had said that they were made of rats' blood. The father had given his young son a lecture about licorice bootlaces when he had caught himself eating one in bed. Every rat catcher in the country, his father had said, takes his rats to the licorice bootlace factory, and the manager pays 2 pence for each rat. Many a rat catcher has become a millionaire by selling his dead rats to the factory. But now, do they turn the rats into licorice? No. But how do they turn the rats into licorice? The young Thwaites had asked his father. They waited until they've got 10,000 rats, the father had answered. Then they dump them into a huge, shiny steel cauldron and boil them up for several hours. 2 men stir the bubbling cauldron with long poles, and in the end, they have a thick, steaming rat stew. After that, a cruncher is lowered into the cauldron to crunch the bones. And what's left is a pulpy substance called rat mash. Yes, but how do they turn all that into licorice bootlaces, Daddy? The young Thwaites had asked, and this question, according to Thwaites, had caused his father to pause and think for a few moments before he answered it. At last, he had said, the 2 men who were doing the stringing with the long poles now put on their Wellington boots and climb into the cauldron and shovel the hot rat mash out onto a concrete floor. Then they run a steamroller over it several times to flatten it out. What is left looks rather like a gigantic black pancake. And all they have to do after that is wait for it to cool and harden so they can cut it into strips to make the bootlaces. Don't ever eat them, the father had said. If you do, you'll get ratitis. What's ratitis, Daddy? Young Thwaites had asked. All the rats that the rat catchers catch are poisoned with rat poison, the father had said. It's the rat poison that gives you ratitis. Yes, but what happens when you catch it, young Thwaites had asked. Your teeth become very sharp and pointed, the father had answered, and a short, stubby tail grows on your back, just above your bottom. There's no cure for ratitis. I ought to know. I am a doctor. We all enjoyed Thwaites' story, and we made him tell it to us many times on our walks to and from school. But it didn't stop any of us, except Thwaites, from buying licorice bootlaces. At 2 for a penny, they were the best value in the shop. A bootlace, in case you haven't had the pleasure of handling one, is not round. It's like a flat black tape, about 1/2 inch wide. You buy it rolled up in a coil, and in those days it used to be so long that when you unrolled it and held it at 1 arm's length above your head, the other end touched the ground. Sherbet suckers were also 2 a penny. Each sucker consisted of a yellow cardboard tube filled with sherbet powder, and there was a hollow licorice straw sticking out of it. Rat's blood again. Young Thwaites would warn us, pointing at the licorice straw. You sucked the sherbet. You sucked the sherbet through the straw, and when it was finished, you ate the licorice. They were delicious, those sherbet suckers. Oh, so challenging. The sherbet fizzed in your mouth, and if you knew how to do it, you could make white froth come out of your nostrils and pretend you were throwing a fit. Gobstoppers costing a penny each were enormous, hard, round balls the size of tomatoes. 1 gobstopper would provide about an hour's worth of non-stop sucking, and if you took it out of your mouth and inspected it every 5 minutes or so, you would find that it had changed colour. There was something fascinating about the way it went from pink to blue to green to yellow. We used to wonder how in the world the Gobstopper factory managed to achieve this magic. How does it happen? We would ask each other. How can they make it keep changing colour? It's your spit that does it, young Thwaites proclaimed. As the son of a doctor, he considered himself to be an authority of all things that had to do with the body. He could tell us about scabs and when they were ready to be picked off. He knew why a black eye was blue and why blood was red. It's your spit that makes the gobstopper change colour, he kept insisting. When we asked him to elaborate on this theory, he said, "You wouldn't understand it if I did tell you." Pear drops were exciting because they had a dangerous taste. They smelled of nail varnish and they froze the back of your throat. All of us were warned against eating them, and the result was that we ate them more than ever. Then there was the hard brown lozenge called the tonsil tickler. The tonsil tickler tasted and smelled very strongly of chloroform. We had not the slightest doubt that these things were saturated in the dreaded anaesthetic, which, as Thwaites had many times pointed out to us, you could put you to sleep for an hour at a stretch. If my father was to saw off somebody's leg, he said, he pours chloroform onto a pad and the person sniffs it and goes to sleep. My father saws off his leg without him even feeling it. But why do they put it into sweets and sell them to us? We asked him. You might think a question like this would have baffled young Thwaites, but Thwaites was never baffled. My father says tonsil ticklers were invented for dangerous prisoners in jail, he said. They give them one each meal and the chloroform makes them sleepy and stops them rioting. Yes, we said, but why do we sell them to children? It's a plot, Thwaites said, a grown-up plot to keep us quiet. The sweet shop in Llandaff in the year 1923 was the very centre of our lives. To us, it was what a bar was to a drunk or a church to a bishop. Without it, there would have been little to live for. But it had one terrible drawback, this sweet shop. The woman who owned it was a horror. We hated her, and we had good reason for doing so. Her name was Mrs. Pratchett. She was a small, skinny old hag with a moustache on her upper lip and a mouth as a sour cherry, as sour as a green gooseberry. She never smiled, she never welcomed us when we went in, and the only time she spoke to us was when she said things like, I'm watching you, so keep your thieving hands off of them chocolates. Or, I don't want you in here, just to look around. Either you forks or you gets out. But by far the most lonesome thing about Mrs. Pratchett was the filth that clung around her. The apron was grey and greasy. Her blouse had bits of breakfast all over it. Toast crumbs and tea stains and splotches of dried egg yolk. It was her hands, however, that disturbed us the most. They were disgusting. They were black with dirt and grime. They looked as though they had been putting lumps of coal on the fire all day long. And do not forget, please, that there was these very hands and fingers that plunged into the sweet jars when we asked for a pennyworth of treacle toffee or wine gums or nut clusters or whatever. There were precious few health laws in those days, and nobody, least of all Mrs. Pratchett, ever thought of using a little shovel for getting out sweets as they do today. The mere sight of her grimy hand with its black fingernails digging into an ounce of chocolate fudge out of the jar would have caused a starving tramp to go running from the shop. But not us. Sweets were our lifeblood. We would have put up with far worse than that to get them. So we simply stood and watched in sullen silence while this disgusting old woman stirred around inside the jar with her foul fingers. The other thing we hated about Mrs. Pratchett was for her meanness. Unless you spent a whole sixpence all in one go, she wouldn't give you a bag. Instead, you got your sweets twisted up in a small piece of newspaper, which she tore off a pile of the old Daily Mirrors lying on the counter. So you can well understand that we had it in for Mrs. Pratchett in a big way, but we didn't quite know what to do about it. Many schemes were put forward, but none of them were any good. None of them, that is, until suddenly one memorable afternoon we found the dead mouse. That's it. So we're moving on to the Great Mouse Plot next chapter. Thanks for joining.